He was offered the highest judicial seat in the Islamic Empire, twice. He said no. Twice. The second time, the ruler of the Muslim world had him imprisoned. And when prison did not break him, he had him poisoned. He died in the position he had spent his entire life in. Bowed down. In prostration. In prayer. This is the story of Imam Abu Hanifa. And welcome back to Echoes of Islamic History TV. In the year 80 after the Hijra, in the city of Kufa, a son was born to a silk trader named Thabit. Thabit was not an Arab. His father, a man named Zuta, had come from Persia, from a respected family, in a land that had only recently opened its heart to Islam. Some storytellers, in later years, tried to claim that Zuta had arrived in Arabia as a slave. But the more reliable historians tell us otherwise. Zuta came as a free man, a new believer, drawn to the land where the final messenger of Allah had once walked. He settled in Kufa. He built a life there. And it was in that city, years later, that his son Thabit was born. There is a story, treasured by the family for generations, that when Thabit was still an infant, Zuta carried him into the presence of Ali ibn Abi Talib himself, the fourth Caliph of Islam, who was ruling from Kufa at that time. Zuta asked the Caliph to bless the child. And Ali, cousin of the Prophet, gate to the city of knowledge, one of the most revered men in all of Islamic history, placed his hand upon the infant and prayed for him. He prayed for the child, and for the children who would come after him. Years later, Thabit grew into a respected merchant, a trader of silk. And when he was 40 years old, his own son was born. He named him Nu'man. No one in that room, no one in that city, no one in the whole of the expanding Muslim world had the faintest idea what this child would become. But history would come to know him by another name entirely, a name that would outlive empires, outlive caliphates, outlive every ruler who ever tried to control him. The world would come to know him as Abu Hanifa. It is worth pausing here, because even his most famous name carries a story. Abu Hanifa was not, as some assumed, a reference to a son named Hanifa. He never had a son by that name. Instead, scholars explain it as a title, drawn from the Quran itself, from the description of the Prophet Ibrahim as Hanif, upright, sincere, devoted purely to the truth. Abu Hanifa, then, was not merely a name. It was a declaration of character before the world had even seen what kind of man he would grow into. Kufa, in those years, was one of the great intellectual capitals of the Islamic world. It was a city still touched by living memory of the Prophet's own companions. In the marketplaces and mosques of Kufa, a young Nu'man would have passed by elderly men who had once looked upon the Messenger of Allah with their own eyes. In fact, history preserves for us a remarkable detail. Among the companions still living in Kufa during Abu Hanifa's early years was a man named Abdullah ibn Abi Awfa. And it is recorded on strong authority that the young Abu Hanifa personally met Anas ibn Malik, the very man who had served as the Prophet's own attendant. Think about that for a moment. This was not a distant historical figure reading about the Prophet's era from old scrolls. This was a boy who breathed the same air as men who had walked beside the Messenger of Allah himself. The chain of transmission, the living link between the first generation of Islam and every generation that would follow, passed directly through him. But here is what makes Abu Hanifa's story so remarkable. He did not begin his life as a scholar. He began it as a merchant. Following in his father's footsteps, the young Nu'man entered the silk trade. He was, by every account, extraordinarily good at it. He was known throughout Kufa for his honesty in business, a trait that seems almost effortless to us now, looking back at the towering scholar he became, but which was, in his own time, simply the character of a young trader building his reputation one transaction at a time. It would have been entirely reasonable, expected even, for Nu'man to have lived out his life exactly this way. A respected merchant. A man of business. A name known in the marketplace and forgotten within a generation, as most names are. But something changed. The details of exactly when and how are debated among the biographers. Some say it was a chance encounter with a scholar named Ash-Shabi, who, noticing something in the young merchant, some spark of seriousness beneath his commercial success, asked him a simple pointed question, whether he attended the circles of knowledge in the city. Nu'man admitted that he did not. His time was consumed by trade, the buying and selling of silk, the negotiating of prices, the endless practical demands of running a business that supported not just himself, but his family's reputation in the city. And Ash-Shabi told him, gently but directly, that he saw in him the bearing of a scholar. That there was a seriousness in the way he carried himself, a sharpness in the way he reasoned through even simple conversations, that suggested his mind was built for something greater than ledgers and transactions. He should not waste it on silk and commerce alone, Ash-Shabi told him. Knowledge was waiting for him, and it would not wait forever. It is easy, looking back across 14 centuries, to imagine this as a small, unremarkable exchange between an older scholar and a young merchant passing through the marketplace. But for Newman, it seems to have landed like a thunderclap. Something in those words refused to leave him. He returned to his business that day, and the next and the one after that, but something inside him had already begun to shift. Whether that exact conversation happened precisely as later generations told it, we cannot say with certainty. Memory softens details over centuries. But what we do know with total historical confidence is this: something in the young merchant's heart shifted. And from that point forward, Newman, the silk trader's son, began walking a different path. He sought out teachers. He sat in circles of learning. And eventually, he found his way to the man who would shape the rest of his intellectual life, a scholar named Hammad ibn Abi Sulayman. Hammad was, at that time, one of the leading jurists of Kufa, standing at the head of a great tradition of legal reasoning that stretched back through his own teacher, Ibrahim al-Nakhai, to the very companions of the Prophet. Abu Hanifa attached himself to Hammad's circle, and he did not attend for a season, or a year, or even a handful of years. He remained a student in that circle for 18 years. 18 years of sitting, listening, questioning, refining his understanding. 18 years in which the silk merchant slowly, patiently, became something else entirely. A jurist. A thinker. A man whose grasp of the sacred law would eventually surpass even that of his own teacher. When Hammad passed away, the students of that circle did something remarkable. They did not scatter to find a new master elsewhere. Instead, they turned to Abu Hanifa himself, the student who had absorbed everything his teacher had to offer, and more, and asked him to take Hammad's seat. He accepted. And for the remainder of his life, a period of roughly 30 years, Abu Hanifa sat at the head of that same circle in Kufa, teaching, reasoning, and building what would eventually become one of the most influential schools of Islamic law in human history. His method was distinctive. Where a ruling could be found directly in the Quran, he turned there first. Where the Quran was silent, he turned to the Sunnah, the practice and sayings of the Prophet. Where neither offered a direct answer, he considered the statements of the companions. And beyond that, he employed careful, structured reasoning, analogy, juristic preference, the customs of the people, always searching methodically for the ruling closest to the spirit and intention of the sacred law. He was known, too, for something almost nobody had done before him at this scale. He did not wait only for real cases to walk through his door. He would pose hypothetical situations to his students, questions about circumstances that had not yet occurred, testing how the principles of Islamic law would apply if they ever did. There is a story preserved from this period that captures his mind perfectly. A visiting scholar named Qatada came to Kufa, and Abu Hanifa went to meet him, posing a complicated hypothetical question about a man who disappears for years, presumed dead, whose wife remarries, and then the first husband returns. What, Abu Hanifa asked, happens to her dowry? Qatada, startled by the complexity of the question, asked him bluntly, has this actually happened? Abu Hanifa's answer reveals the entire philosophy of his life's work. We prepare for difficulty before it arrives, he said, so that when it comes, we already know how to meet it. This was not idle intellectual game-playing. This was a man building an entire legal framework in advance, anticipating the countless situations a growing Muslim community, spreading now across a vast and diverse empire, would eventually face. He was not simply answering the questions of his own day. He was building a structure sturdy enough to answer questions for centuries he would never live to see. And in this, he succeeded beyond anything even he could have imagined. But before we follow him into the political storms that would eventually consume the final years of his life, it is worth pausing here, to understand exactly what kind of man this scholarship had produced. Because Abu Hanifa was not merely a brilliant legal mind locked away in books and abstractions. He was, by every surviving account, a man whose character matched the towering reputation of his intellect. He never abandoned the trade of his father entirely. Even as his fame as a jurist grew, Abu Hanifa continued to run a large silk business, trading in goods worth staggering sums, with agents operating in cities across the region. And it was here, in the ordinary business of buying and selling, that his character revealed itself most clearly. There is a story preserved from this period of his life that captures it perfectly. He had once sent a shipment of silk to an associate named Hafs, with clear instructions to point out certain defects in some of the fabric to any buyer before the sale was completed. Hafs, in the rush of business, forgot to mention the flaws. The silk sold. The money came in. When Abu Hanifa learned what had happened, that customers had unknowingly purchased defective goods without being told, he did not simply shrug it off as an acceptable cost of doing business. He was deeply troubled by it. And so he gave away the entire proceeds of that sale, some 30,000 dirhams, to charity. Not because the law required it of him. Because his own conscience did. This was not an isolated act. Once, a woman came to him wanting to sell a length of silk cloth, unaware of its true value. She named a price of 100 silver coins. Abu Hanifa, astonished, told her that the cloth was worth far more than she realized. She raised her price, suspicious that he was mocking her. He raised it again himself, insisting the fabric was worth 5 times what she had originally asked, and paid her that higher amount out of his own pocket. His generosity extended well beyond business dealings. He kept a mental ledger, so to speak, of every struggling student and scholar in his circle, quietly providing stipends to those too poor to support themselves while pursuing their studies, so that hunger and financial anxiety would never be the reason a promising mind abandoned the pursuit of knowledge. One of the young scholars he supported in this way would go on to become one of the most celebrated jurists of the age in his own right, a student named Abu Yusuf, whose name would later echo through the courts of Caliphs. There is a particularly touching story of a proud but struggling man who came to visit him one day. After his other guests had left, Abu Hanifa quietly asked the man to lift the prayer mat he had been sitting on. Beneath it, the man discovered a purse containing 1,000 silver coins. Understanding immediately what was being offered to him, the man, out of pride, insisted that he did not need charity. Abu Hanifa's gentle response has survived across the centuries. Then you should not dress in a way that makes people think you are poor and in need. He had seen through the man's pride to the real hardship underneath it, and had found a way to offer help without ever forcing the man to openly beg for it. Even when money was owed to him, his instinct leaned toward mercy rather than collection. On one occasion, walking toward the home of a sick friend, he spotted at a distance a man who owed him 10,000 dirhams, a considerable sum. The man, embarrassed, tried to slip away and avoid him. Abu Hanifa caught up with him anyway, not to demand payment, but simply to ask why he had been avoided. When the man confessed his shame at being unable to repay the debt, Abu Hanifa simply told him, "If you are unable to repay it, then you need not repay it at all." And his temperament matched his generosity. Despite his towering reputation, despite the wealth his business had brought him, those who knew him described him as remarkably gentle, soft-spoken, and slow to anger. One day, while teaching in the mosque surrounded by his students, a man in the crowd grew furious at something Abu Hanifa had said, and hurled a truly vile insult directly at him in front of the entire gathering. The room fell into uproar. Several students moved to seize the man and punish him for his disrespect. Abu Hanifa stopped them. He calmly allowed the outburst to pass, restored order to the room himself, and then, without a trace of anger in his voice, simply continued answering the man's original question as though nothing at all had happened. He would later say of himself that in his entire life, he had never cursed another person, never sought revenge against anyone who had wronged him, and never broken a promise he had made. Whether every detail of that claim can be verified by history or not, the surviving stories about him consistently point in exactly this direction, a man whose brilliance in argument was matched, and perhaps even exceeded, by his patience in character. His humility extended even to those who disagreed with him, or who spoke against him behind his back. For a period of time, his relationship with another towering scholar of the age, Sufyan al-Thawri, had grown strained, the kind of quiet professional tension that can develop between two brilliant minds working in the same field. One day, someone came to Abu Hanifa eager to stir up conflict, reporting that Sufyan had been speaking critically of him. Abu Hanifa's response carried no trace of wounded pride. "May God forgive both of us," he said simply. "Sufyan is so great a scholar that if he had died even during the lifetime of our teacher Ibrahim al-Nakhai, the Muslims would have mourned him as one of the greats." Rather than defend his own reputation, he chose instead to defend the reputation of the very man who had spoken against him. A similar moment reveals the same instinct. Once, while teaching a class, Abu Hanifa answered a legal question, and a man in the audience pointed out that another respected scholar, Hassan al-Basri, had once given a different ruling on the same matter. Abu Hanifa answered plainly, then Hassan Basri made a mistake. This response enraged one of Hassan al-Basri's own students, who shouted a vile insult at Abu Hanifa in front of the entire gathering, demanding to know how he dared suggest that so respected a scholar could ever be wrong. The room erupted. Several people moved to physically remove the man for his disrespect. Abu Hanifa intervened immediately, stopping them. And once calm had been restored, he turned back to the very man who had just insulted him and, without any trace of anger in his voice, simply repeated his position, clarifying, patiently and respectfully, exactly which authentic transmission from the Prophet's companion supported his own conclusion. He did not need to raise his voice to win the argument. He only needed to be right, and to say so with dignity intact, both his own and his opponent's. This, then, was the man the political powers of his age would soon come calling for. Not merely a scholar. A man whose integrity was, by this point, simply who he was, tested, proven, and unshakable. But scholarship and gentleness of character, however brilliant, do not exist in a vacuum. And Abu Hanifa lived through some of the most turbulent political decades in early Islamic history. For roughly the first 50 years of his life, the Umayyad dynasty ruled the Muslim world from Damascus. And as that dynasty aged, its grip on power weakened. Rebellions stirred in different corners of the empire. Iraq, and Kufa in particular, became a center of unrest. The Umayyad governor of Iraq at that time was a capable, ambitious man named Yazid ibn Umar Hubayra. Recognizing that his rule needed legitimacy beyond mere military force, Yazid began appointing respected religious scholars to positions of authority within his administration, hoping their reputations would lend weight and credibility to his government. He set his sights on Abu Hanifa. By this point in his life, Abu Hanifa's reputation had already spread well beyond Kufa. He was known not merely as a capable jurist, but as a man of unimpeachable integrity, precisely the kind of name that could lend real legitimacy to a shaky government. Yazid understood this. He needed men like Abu Hanifa standing beside him, not because he necessarily respected their scholarship for its own sake, but because their reputations were valuable currency in an unstable political climate. He offered him a position as treasurer and secretary, a post of real power, real income, and real prestige. It was the kind of offer that could transform a scholar's life, elevating him from a respected teacher in a local circle to a man with genuine influence over the machinery of empire. Abu Hanifa refused. Yazid, unwilling to accept the refusal, swore an oath that he would force Abu Hanifa to accept the position regardless. And Abu Hanifa responded with words that have echoed through 14 centuries of Islamic memory. If Yazid were to ask me merely to count the doors of the mosques, he said, I would not agree to do even that for him, let alone put my seal on the death warrant of a Muslim signed by his hand. He understood with total clarity exactly what accepting that post would eventually require of him. Signing off on the punishments, the executions, the machinery of a government he did not trust to wield justice fairly. And he would not be a part of it. Not even in the smallest way. Yazid's fury was immediate. He had Abu Hanifa thrown into prison. And he ordered that he be given 100 lashes, administered daily, until his will broke. Imagine this for a moment. A scholar. A teacher. A man whose entire life's work was built on gentleness of reasoning and careful thought. Subjected day after day to physical punishment, not for any crime, not for any injustice he had committed, but simply for saying no to a position of worldly power. And he did not break. It was Yazid, in the end, who relented, who stopped the punishment before Abu Hanifa ever agreed to serve him. Abu Hanifa was released. And according to the most reliable accounts, he left for Mecca shortly afterward, remaining there for a period, perhaps sensing that greater political storms were still to come. He was right to sense it. In the year 132 after the Hijra, the Umayyad dynasty collapsed entirely, swept away by the rising Abbasid movement. The new rulers did not simply defeat their predecessors, they hunted down the remnants of the Umayyad family with a thoroughness that shocked even hardened observers of that violent age. The first Abbasid Caliph, Abu al-Abbas al-Safa, ruled only a few years before his death. He was succeeded by his brother, a far more ruthless and calculating man, who would come to be known as Al-Mansur. Mansur's reign began under the same dark cloud of suspicion and cruelty that had marked the transition of power. And soon uprisings began again, this time from descendants of the Prophet's own family, the Alids, who believed that leadership of the Muslim world rightfully belonged to them. One of these uprisings was led by a man named Muhammad, known as Al-Nafs al-Zakiyah, the pure soul, and after his death in battle, by his brother Ibrahim. The stories that survive from this period reveal just how deeply this conflict weighed on the people who lived through it. Ibrahim, we are told, was so consumed by the uprising that he went 2 full months without changing his clothes, sitting with his pillow clutched in his hands, murmuring again and again the same haunting question. I don't know whether this pillow belongs to me or to Ibrahim. Meaning that he did not know whether he or his rival Mansur would be the one still breathing by the time this war reached its end. Abu Hanifa's sympathies in this conflict were not hidden. He had watched the excesses of the new Abbasid rulers with growing unease, and he openly supported Ibrahim's cause, offering financial support, and according to some accounts, wishing desperately that circumstances had allowed him to join the fighting itself, though certain obligations held him back, a fact he reportedly regretted for the rest of his life. Ibrahim's rebellion, like his brothers before it, ultimately failed. He died fighting bravely at Basra, his 100,000 supporters unable to overcome the machinery of the empire arrayed against them. And Mansur, victorious but paranoid, and unwilling to forgive anyone who had shown sympathy to his enemies, turned his attention to those who had supported the uprising. Among them was Abu Hanifa. By this time, Mansur had relocated his capital away from Kufa entirely, founding a new city that would become one of the great centers of the Islamic world, Baghdad. And it was to Baghdad, in the year 146 after the Hijra, that Mansur summoned Abu Hanifa to appear before him. Picture the scene as it has come down to us through history. A grand hall in a newly built capital, still smelling of fresh mortar and ambition. Guards lining the walls. Courtiers whispering among themselves. And at the center of it all, seated on a raised platform, the most feared man in the Islamic world, Al-Mansur, builder of Baghdad, destroyer of the family that had ruled before him. Into this room walks Abu Hanifa. Now an elderly man, well into his 60s, his beard streaked with age, his silk merchant's fortune long since converted into something far more valuable, a lifetime of scholarship that had made his name known from one end of the empire to the other. The chamberlain, a man named Rabi, introduces him to the Caliph with genuine reverence. This man is the greatest living scholar. Mansur, testing him, asks about his teachers, and Abu Hanifa recites the chain, name after name, tracing his knowledge back through a lineage of scholars connected directly to the companions of the Prophet themselves. And then Mansur makes his move. He offers Abu Hanifa the position of Qadi, chief judge of the entire empire. It is, on paper, the single greatest honor that could be offered to any scholar of Islamic law in that era. The authority to interpret and apply the sacred law across the vast territories under Abbasid rule. Wealth. Prestige. A permanent place in the historical record as the highest judicial authority of his age. Abu Hanifa refused. Flatly. Immediately. He told the Caliph, without hesitation, that he was not fit for the post. Mansur, enraged at being refused a second time by the same man, shouted at him, "You are lying." And Abu Hanifa answered with a piece of logic so sharp, so immediate, that it has been repeated in Islamic scholarly circles for well over 1,000 years since. "If I am lying," he said, "then my statement that I am unfit for the post of judge is true, because a liar cannot be trusted with the position of judge." The court fell into stunned silence. Mansur swore an oath that he would force Abu Hanifa to accept the position regardless of his objections. And Abu Hanifa, standing before the most powerful man in the Islamic world, swore his own oath in return, that he would never accept it. The chamberlain, astonished at what he was witnessing, said to him directly, "Abu Hanifa, you dare to oppose the Caliph's oath with an oath of your own?" And Abu Hanifa's reply reveals, perhaps more than any other moment in his life, the depth of his conviction. "Yes, I do," he said, "because it is easier for the commander of the faithful to atone for the sin of breaking his oath, than it is for me to atone for mine." He understood, with total clarity, what was at stake. Not merely a job. Not merely a position of comfort or influence. He understood that accepting the seat of judge under this particular ruler, in this particular moment of political violence and suspicion, would mean lending his name, the most trusted name in Islamic jurisprudence, to decisions he might never be able to make according to his own conscience. He would rather refuse a caliph to his face than compromise the integrity of the sacred law he had spent his entire life studying. Mansur, this time, did not relent. He ordered Abu Hanifa's imprisonment. But here is what makes this final chapter of his story so remarkable. Even in prison, Abu Hanifa's influence did not diminish. If anything, it grew. Baghdad had become the great intellectual capital of the Islamic world, and students from across the empire continued flocking toward it, seeking knowledge. Somehow, even from within his cell, Abu Hanifa continued teaching. It was there in that prison that one of his greatest students, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, a man who would go on to become one of the towering figures of the Hanafi school of law, received instruction directly from him. Mansur, watching from a distance, understood the problem clearly. Abu Hanifa was, if anything, more dangerous to his authority in prison than he had ever been outside of it. His imprisonment had not silenced him. It had made him a symbol. And so Mansur made his final fatal decision. He had Abu Hanifa poisoned. The scholars who recorded his final moments tell us that when Abu Hanifa felt the poison beginning to take effect, he did not cry out, and he did not resist. Instead, he lowered himself into prostration, into sujud, the position of prayer, the position in which a believer places his forehead upon the ground before his Creator. And it was there, in that posture of complete submission to Allah, that Imam Abu Hanifa passed from this world. It happened in the month of Rajab, in the year 150 after the Hijra. News of his death spread through Baghdad like fire through dry grass. The city's own judge, a man named Hassan ibn Amra, personally washed his body, and as he did, witnesses recorded that he could not stop repeating the same words, over and over. By God, you were the greatest jurist and the most pious man of our time. You had every quality of greatness within you. No one after you may ever hope to reach your level. By the time the body had been prepared, so vast a crowd had gathered in the streets of Baghdad that a single funeral prayer could not accommodate them all. The prayer was performed once. And then the crowd had grown too large, so it was performed again. And again. In total, the funeral prayer for Imam Abu Hanifa was repeated 6 separate times that day, with estimates suggesting that as many as 50,000 people came to stand in prayer over his body before the sun finally set and he was laid to rest. Think of what that scene must have looked like. Row after row of mourners, stretching further than any single prayer line could hold, forming again and again beneath the darkening Baghdad sky, each new group waiting patiently for its turn to send this man off with the dignity his life had earned. Merchants who had never met him personally. Students who had studied under him for decades. Ordinary people who had simply heard his name spoken with respect in the marketplaces of a city he had once been imprisoned in. It is said that Abu Hanifa, in his final days, had expressed a wish to be buried in a particular graveyard at a place called Kaisran, a request that was honored. And so, in that quiet plot of earth in Baghdad, the body of a man who had once been a silk trader's son, who had refused 2 caliphs to their faces, who had been whipped and imprisoned and finally poisoned for his refusal to bend, was laid to rest. 50,000 people. For a man who, in his own lifetime, had twice refused the highest positions of worldly power the Islamic Empire could offer him. But a school of thought this vast cannot rest on the shoulders of one man alone, however brilliant. And here, too, Abu Hanifa's foresight proved remarkable. Throughout his decades of teaching in Kufa, and even in his final months confined to a Baghdad prison cell, he had been quietly building something that would outlive him, a circle of students capable of carrying his reasoning forward into a future he would never see. Chief among them was Abu Yusuf, the very student whose education Abu Hanifa had once quietly financed, back when he was a poor young man struggling to balance the pursuit of knowledge against the demands of feeding his family. Abu Yusuf would go on to become the chief judge of the entire Abbasid Empire, serving directly under Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the very position Abu Hanifa himself had twice refused. Through Abu Yusuf, the reasoning and methodology of his teacher spread directly into the highest judicial institutions of the Islamic world, carried there by a student who had learned every principle at his teacher's feet. And there was Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, the young scholar who, remarkably, had received part of his education from Abu Hanifa while the Imam himself sat imprisoned. Al-Shaybani would go on to systematically record and preserve Abu Hanifa's legal reasoning in written form, producing the foundational texts that would allow the Hanafi school to be studied, taught, and applied with precision for every generation that followed. Without Al-Shaybani's careful documentation, much of what we know of Abu Hanifa's legal thought might have been lost to the passage of time, preserved only in fragments and second-hand memory. Together, these students, and the students who came after them, took the reasoning of a silk merchant's son from Kufa and carried it across an empire, and then across the centuries, until it became the single most widely followed school of Islamic law anywhere on earth. Today, 14 centuries later, the school of law he founded, the Hanafi school, is followed by more Muslims than any other legal school on the face of the earth. From Turkey to Central Asia, from the Indian subcontinent to vast populations across the Arab world, the reasoning of a silk merchant's son from Kufa, who chose imprisonment over compromise, continues to shape how hundreds of millions of Muslims understand and practice their faith to this very day. He built no empire. He commanded no army. He never sat on the judicial seat he was twice offered, in defiance of two of the most powerful rulers the Islamic world had ever seen. And yet his influence outlasted every single one of them. Consider the strange justice of it. Yazid ibn Umar Hubaira, the Umayyad governor who had him whipped for refusing a treasury post, is remembered today, if at all, as a minor administrator of a dynasty that collapsed within his own lifetime. Al-Mansur, the caliph who built an entire city and had a defenseless elderly scholar poisoned rather than let him walk free, is remembered today primarily as a footnote in the story of the very man he could not break. Meanwhile, the silk trader's son from Kufa, the man with no army, no throne, no political office of any kind, is remembered by 13 or 14 centuries of Muslims, across dozens of countries and cultures and languages, as Al-Imam Al-Azam, the great Imam. It is worth sitting with that title for a moment, because it was not handed to him by any government, or any court, or any office of authority. It was given to him, generation after generation, by the ordinary believers who studied his reasoning, followed his rulings, and found in his life a model of what it looks like to hold both brilliance and integrity at once, without ever letting one compromise the other. That is, in the end, the whole story of Imam Abu Hanifa. Not a man who sought power. A man power sought out again and again, and a man who again and again said no. Thank you for watching.